Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to look at a Neil Young album which actually, believe it or not, I'd never heard before this week. It's great discovering an album which is 40 years old nearly, and never heard it. I mean, Neil Young is such a prolific artist that I have to admit I haven't discovered all of his albums. I've got about, I don't know, 10 or 12, I guess, of his. But anyway, this one I saw in a local record shop here in Budapest, and I decided to pick it up. Didn't know much about it. I've played it 5 or 6 times, and I think it's quite a revelation, to be honest with you. Before I go through the album, I'm just going to tell you the background to this album, because Neil Young had signed with David Geffen, who started his career in the 70s and signed Donna Summer in the late 70s, and then famously John Lennon for the Double Fantasy. And he'd got Neil, which was quite a coup. And then the first album that Neil put out on Geffen was a record called Trans in 1982, and it sort of bombed commercially, and David Geffen was pissed off and basically said to Neil, this is not good enough, or something like that. And Neil came back with the proposed next album, which was a country album, and Geffen said, no, you got to do a rock and roll album. So Neil took that rather literally and said to himself, what is rock and roll? And came up with this album in 1983, Everybody's Rocking, by the Shocking Pinks, Neil Young and the Shocking Pinks. It's a dreadful cover, and it's been pretty badly reviewed by critics. I picked it up because it was relatively cheap the other day, and I played it. It's inoffensive for the most part, and I don't mind it. It's not the kind of thing you'd play very often, sort of doo-wop 50s rock and roll, if you remember a band called Shawaddy Waddy, that kind of stuff, but with Neil on lead vocal. So I'd rather have Neil on lead vocal than anyone else. So if you're going to listen to that kind of music, it's okay. Neil at the time, or a few years later, said, is it the greatest thing I've done? Obviously not. So he was aware that he was almost taking the mickey in putting out this album, and I'm pretty sure it didn't do very well commercially either. So by this stage, David Geffen was getting a little bit desperate. So then the next thing Neil does is put out the country album, which he'd promised before. And that's a good album, and there's nothing wrong with Neil Young doing country. I'm not sure why David Geffen would object to that, because Harvest, his big breakthrough album in '72, was pretty much a country album, or certainly a lot of the hits on it were. So there's nothing wrong with this album, Old Ways. I think there's some great songs written by Neil himself, country songs like Once an Angel, and then there's a great cover song of The Wayward Wind, which is a great opener to the album, which he didn't write. There's a song to his son called My Boy, which is kind of a bit reminiscent of Already Won from Comes a Time, which was also about his son, and also about his marriage, actually. So yeah, I like this album. I like it a lot. Nothing wrong with it at all. So David Geffen, meantime, is seething. So Neil Young decides after this to come up with this album, and he said he was basically coming out of the trees, is the phrase he used. I think the only reason he did the rockabilly and the country album is basically he wasn't going to allow anyone, David Geffen or otherwise, to tell him what to do. So a little bit perverse of him to do that, but not really. If you think of Neil Young as an artist, country music fits his style like a glove, and that was evident on Comes a Time from '78, his classic album from then, and then on Bits of Rust Never Sleeps, he's doing great country stuff, and throughout his career he really has done that, so nothing wrong with it. Landing on Water, decided to go with Danny Cooch, or his full name is Danny Korchmar. People call him Danny Cooch. He'd worked with, I seem to remember, Harry Nilsson in the mid-'70s, various other people, and Neil brought him in to produce it, and he'd heard this big drum sound on the radio, early 80s drum sound, and he said, I want that drum sound. I don't particularly want the style of music they're doing, but I want that drum sound. So he brought in Steve Jordan, who plays superb drums on this album. He really does. And I gather there was a bit of tension because Crazy Horse were a bit pissed off that he was using other musicians, and the sessions were a bit fraught as a result of that. So not particularly happy memories making it, but I think this is a fine album. And Steve Jordan's drumming, well, if you don't know who Steve Jordan is, he currently drums with the Rolling Stones since Charlie passed away, and he'd toured and drummed on Keith Richards' solo albums. So that's where I know him from mostly. And his drumming style reminded me a bit of Russ Kenkel from Warren Zevon's Excitable Boy album, although it's even more sort of flamboyant than that. I was thinking of the drums on Lawyers, Guns and Money, and on this album he's just not only pounding the beat, but he's doing these great sort of rolls in between the beats, and I just think it's very powerful stuff. And I'm not normally a fan of so-called 80s production, but I think it works here. And this album was a year before Cloud 9, George Harrison's comeback album, and I think the production is superior on this one. So let's go through the tracks. Well, first of all, the cover. This is got an amusing cover of aeroplane landing on water, and Neil Young had seen the safety card in the plane, and he was amused by all these people in the life raft saying they wouldn't have a hope in hell if a plane lands on water. The likelihood is they're all going to die. So that was how he was feeling a bit with his falling out with David Geffen. So he put that on the cover, and the inside is a picture of Neil in a plane landing on water, and then the lyrics. And I actually sat down with this record when I bought it on vinyl. I'd listened to it on Spotify a couple of times, but I bought it on vinyl the other day, and I actually sat down with the lyrics, which is the first time I'd done that with an album for a long time, and it was great, because sometimes when you listen to an album you're not concentrating enough to follow what he's saying. But so I think the album starts off with Weight of the World, which is quite a decent opener. It's not my favourite track on the album, and then it really hits its stride, this album, with the second song, Violent Side. Just great production, and play this one loud. I think someone in Neil's team, or one of the managers, said when he put this in his car and played it loud, it was the most claustrophobic record he'd ever heard. It was just sort of, it was all over you, and I see what he means. Because if you play this one loud, Steve Jordan's drumming just fills the room. And Violent Side is a great song, and Hippie Dream is another superb number. Bad News Beat, all really strong numbers. I wouldn't say it's overly melodic in terms of, classical Neil Young, let's sing along tune kind of thing, but very, very noticeable production, and Neil singing very well as usual. And Touch the Night closes off side one, and that was backed with the San Francisco Boys Choir, I note. People on the Street is open to side two, and it's a song about homeless people. Hard Luck Stories is allegedly his sort of riposte to David Geffen. Don't tell me your hard luck stories and I won't tell you mine. David Geffen was always complaining about Neil, but I've seen some recent interviews with Neil, and he says all is forgiven now. Maybe I wasn't as receptive to his ideas as I should have been, and he'd put a lot of money and faith into me, and maybe he was trying to scare me into doing something. So there's no hard feelings. They've apparently made up. But he did leave the label pretty soon after this album. I think this might have been the last one before he joined Reprise. Let me see, 86. What's this Notes for You was next. I don't think that was on Geffen. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what else can we say about this album? Yeah, so I Got a Problem, Pressure and Drifter. I mean, I can't really distinguish. I listened to this album 5 or 6 times so far, and I can remember Hard Luck Stories and Violent Side in particular, but the others kind of sort of meld into one. and I remember bits and pieces, but the overall thing which grabs you on this album is relentless drumming from Steve Jordan, and also, unlike a lot of 80s albums, the sort of very strong presence of electric guitar played by Neil, which makes it less dated in its sound and gives a kind of harder edge to it. And I think the combination of the drums and the guitar is very strong. I'm not sure who plays bass. Actually, there's no bass player credited here, so maybe the bass is done on the synthesizer, but Danny Korchmar is credited with guitar, synthesizer and vocals. I'm not sure if that includes bass. And Neil Young, lead guitar, synthesizer, vocals. Steve Gordon, drums, synthesizer, vocals. So, recorded at Record One in Los Angeles. So I really like this album, and I think it's what he did in the 80s, sort of sticking a finger or two fingers, depending on the custom I'm not sure what the custom in Canada is, but sticking up the finger to the record company and say, nope, I'm not going to do what you tell me to do, I'm going to do exactly what I like. And actually, when he'd signed with Geffen, there was a clause in it saying no interference in the creative side of things. And so when David Geffen tried to sue Neil came back with a counter claim for a lot more money, and I think it was settled out of court. And so Neil basically won the case. But this episode of the 80s, this saga with David Geffen, is kind of reminiscent of what happened after Harvest in 72. So whereas here we'd had Rust Never Sleeps, huge hit in 79, and then he sort of, I haven't really talked about Hawks and Doves and Reactor, and then he signed with Geffen and came up with these uncommercial records, so-called, which is exactly what he'd done after Harvest in 72. He was asked to come up with Harvest 2, which he eventually did 20 years later with Harvest Moon, but at the time in the 70s, he didn't want to do that. And so he came up with this trilogy of the Ditch trilogy, as it's called. Famous quote from Neil saying, I got bored of the middle of the road, so I headed for the ditch. And he came up with Time Fades Away, Tonight's the Night, and On the Beach, which are very bleak records and reflected his losing of a couple of mates of his who died. And they were just very hard-edged and not very commercial, not very radio-friendly, although they've got some great stuff on it and on them. And I would say those three albums are probably my favourite three Neil Young albums, along with Comes a Time and Rust Never Sleeps. But this one I'm very glad I discovered, and also very fond of Old Ways. Not so fond of the Rockabilly album, but I'm glad I've got it in the collection. It is a dreadful cover, it has to be said. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.